Okay, and the last of the international questions comes from Argentina. He says, and this also, by the way, this question comes from Argentina, but it echoes several other questions that we've gotten in from developing sector countries that are actually far less developed than Argentina. But the questioner says, Mr. LaRouche, the history of my country has shown that it has often been necessary to fight with other nations so as not to sacrifice our national sovereignty. One example of this was the confrontation between Braden and Colonel Juan Perón in 1945. It was only at great cost that the United States finally understood not only Argentina's sovereignty and national pride, but that of other countries as well. At that time, through Braden, the U.S. expressed a mentality of it's either us or Nazi fascism, and this was a terrible mistake. It is difficult to maintain a community of principles when there is such international and international disparity. It is also unlikely that a powerful nation would cede to the just position of a weaker nation. It seems to me that a weak but sovereign state has greater success in isolating private interests to pursue its national goals than a powerful nation in which the private interests are stronger. When these latter interests interfere, it becomes difficult to reach agreements among nations that will be respected. When weak and strong nations sign agreements, it is the more powerful nation that must display unimpeachable behavior and be held more accountable rather than the weaker one. Otherwise, suspicions arise. Mr. LaRouche, taking into account the enormous disparity of power among nations today, how can agreements be reached that reflect a congruence between the internal general welfare goals of sovereign nation states and international objectives? How does a country regain its sovereignty? Through international agreements or as a result of each country's internal dynamic, which confers on the state its sovereign character? Or is it through both things? Is a degree of local sovereignty possible without international agreements?
I would say it is impossible to have local sovereignty without having international agreements which destroy the empire. One has to understand there's only one empire on this planet. It's the British Empire. And the British Empire is not a secretion of the British people. And people who don't know history but rely on what they consider facts as current facts don't understand this. Because people don't know classical history. They have generally in universities, people come out of these universities with no understanding whatsoever of classical history. You have to go back to the ancient Egypt and these kinds of things. This period, you have to go back to the so-called history of Greece, in which this is made clear. You have to look at the evolution from the self-destruction of Greece in the Peloponnesian War for the advantage of the cult of Apollo. The enemy that Plato wanted to destroy was the cult of Apollo. Because that was the problem. That was the problem. Now, since that time, since those times, because this was the beginning of the imperial maritime culture and its offshoots, which have ruled the world or dominated the world ever since, especially on the Atlantic side, Mediterranean and Atlantic side. And the problem has been essentially what became, through the process of the triadic relationship of the Middle East, Egypt, and Italy, which was united finally as an empire through a certain process, which became the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was destroyed by itself in a catastrophe. It became then the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire was destroyed in less than 1,000 years of self-destruction. But it managed to crush France, the Charlemagne's France, in the meantime. The Venetians from 1000 AD approximately maintained a control. All European empires are centered on the Venetian system. For example, let's take the case of Henry VIII as an example of this. Henry VIII was an idiot with real problems. I think he would say serious problems. He would say that in schools when you're talking about a certain pupil in a school or a teacher in a school. He's got a serious problem. He had a serious problem. But the problem was used. You're going to, say, 1492, before the general period of warfare from 1492 to 1648 was unleashed in Europe. But you had a system, despite the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, was the first act of criminality, of international criminality, which was expressed in Europe in that time. But that led to a conflict. Now, in this period, despite the fact the Habsburgs had taken over the Kingdom of Spain and Portugal, and despite the Habsburgs had taken over much of Italy, you had France and you had England. So these four powers were in sort of a kind of balance, in affecting part of Germany as well. They were in a balance. Now, what happened? Henry VIII. But it wasn't Henry VIII. It was a Venetian operation which set this thing into motion. And they took Henry VIII, a fool, and they played him on the question of the marriage of Henry VIII to a Spanish Habsburg princess. The divorce of Henry VIII from this princess was used to divide the religion of the Catholic religion of Western Europe into a warring quarrel, which has continued in one form or the other to the present day. The creation of Henry VIII as a degenerate is the antecedent for what became the British Empire. Now, in this process, you have a period from 1492, the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, to 1648, the Peace of Westphalia. During this period, there was a transition philosophically from Aristotelian doctrine, which is also rotten, to Plato was opposed to this nonsense, to the doctrine of Paolo Sappi. And Paolo Sappi's doctrine is that he has a principle, but there is no principle allowed for the people. So what became European culture, so-called European liberalism, after Sappi, is that the British Empire is nothing but an extension of a transnational grouping of people and forces which are the forces organized around the central figure of the British monarchy, what became the British monarchy, by the theories of Paolo Sappi. This was consolidated Leibniz tried to stop this process, but didn't succeed. So therefore, with 1763, you had the establishment of the British Empire. But the British Empire is actually Paris into Paris. Take, for example, the Napoleonic Wars. What was Napoleon? Well, he was something you wouldn't, excretion from the back of a cow or something. But he was used for what? He was used, you look at 1782. The United States has established its independence by victory against Cornwallis. What was behind that? The French, the Spanish monarchy, the French monarchy, and the Russians, Catherine the Great, leading the coalition of League of Armed Neutrality. And these forces in Europe were the key strategic forces which enabled the United States to win its freedom in 1782 against the British. What happened? The British East India Office, which was established in 1782 on behalf of the British East India Company at the time, ran intelligence operations in Europe, including the operation known as the Queen's Necklace scandal in France. This was used to topple France, and wars lodged by Napoleon destroyed Russia to a large degree. Every part of continental Europe was essentially destroyed by Napoleon. And what happened when Napoleon quit, or was quitted? Well, what happened is the British Empire stepped in and established itself as the British Empire over Europe. And despite the revolts which have occurred in continental Europe against the British Empire is Europe, is Western Europe, is Europe, and runs Europe today. And why does it run Europe? Because the dumb Europeans are foolish enough to play the game. The game became serious when the United States won against the British in our Civil War. Our Civil War was a war against the British, nothing else. 1876, we had reached the pinnacle of our power as a growing power. At that, we also continued to reach power because Bismarck adopted the American system, as I've said before, and Russia adopted the American system in part, not as a system, but as a strategic outlook. Europe accepted the American system set forth. What did the British do? They used various wars to undermine this process, and then in 1890, by firing Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, they were able to orchestrate, through the idiot of Austria, the Habsburg idiot, to orchestrate a Balkan War, which was then used to get Germany opposed to Russia. Now the Emperor of Russia, they called, and the Kaiser of Germany, were both idiots. And they were both nephews of the Crown Prince of Britain. He organized his two nephews to make a war against each other. In 1905, they had a meeting on a yacht in the Baltic. And they're all there. And the Kaiser and the Tsar looked at each other. Our uncle is trying to kill us. Yes, but despite the fact they knew this and recognized this, they went ahead and played the game. It's just like the war in Iraq war. 2 Iraq wars, totally unnecessary. We played the game. What's happened now? The Afghanistan war. We played the game. Who runs the Afghanistan war, the trap that the United States troops are in? The British Empire. The British Empire, which runs the drug operation, which the Obama administration is protecting treasonously. We're sending troops in to be killed because we are protecting a British drug operation in direct cooperation with the British monarchy. And that's the way you have to look at these kinds of things. That's what our problem is.